Representative Lee of Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to the panel for your testimony. Artificial intelligence and its algorithms are built by humans, and they're trained on data that's created by humans, which means it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that AI often reinforces the same implicit and explicit biases that humans carry, classism or sexism, racism, ableism. I just want to really lift up that we can't ignore the capacity of AI to deepen the systemic inequalities already facing marginalized communities, and AI in K through 12 schools isn't any different. With a dismantled Department of Education, where a drastically reduced Office of Civil Rights, or excuse me, Office for Civil Rights is being weaponized to undercut students' civil rights, K to 12 schools are unprepared to address the vast inequities that can come with AI. So we should be especially concerned about rapidly expanding school surveillance AI that includes facial recognition technology with error rates of 35% for Black girls, and online chat monitoring and so-called aggression detection that is layered with racialized assumptions about communication. Much of this surveillance technology is an extension of histories of scientific racism and eugenics. Ms. Mote, in your testimony, you referenced a resource created last year by the Department of Education on avoiding the discriminatory use of artificial intelligence. The Department of Education under the last administration created this resource to inform schools of how AI can violate student civil rights. It included examples like facial recognition, consistently misidentifying Black students, and predictive algorithms flagging Black students as more likely to carry out disciplinary infractions. So without resources like this from the Department of Education, are schools equipped to keep students' civil rights intact when deploying AI surveillance?
It's important to name that there's no tool, as you mentioned, in education that is without bias. Every tool in use in America's classrooms today has algorithmic unreliability or bias built in because it's built by humans. And as you so aptly mentioned, it repeats the bias that's already in existing data sets or the bias that is held by the developers themselves. There's tools to mitigate this effect, something called reweighting, which allows you to actually index for students with disabilities or students from subgroups. But in order to do that, to have the data to be able to train those models to be more equitable, to be more fair, to offer opportunity for every student, you need data and data infrastructure. And right now, we are seeing a dismantling of our data infrastructure at the federal level. The very data sets that would allow industry, that would allow researchers, that would allow others to use that data to be able to train these tools to mitigate bias. It's really important that we name that there's no way to eliminate bias, but we can provide guidance, like the guidance you mentioned, provide data for training, and work alongside industry to mitigate bias that exists in these tools.
Yeah, thank you. But the fact that we can no longer rely on the Department of Education to serve its key functions, including its jobs of safeguarding students against discriminatory AI surveillance, is especially concerning, since school surveillance technology is a multi-billion-dollar industry that seems to really elude oversight and accountability. So, Ms. Mote, do the companies selling their AI surveillance to schools typically evaluate their algorithms for racial bias? And how important is it that these companies evaluate and monitor their products to mitigate that bias?
One challenge for all companies that are using AI right now is they can only look at the data that they have themselves. So let me go back to my days of making copies in the copy room. Has anyone ever made a Xerox of a paper, and then you make a Xerox of it again, and then you make a Xerox of it again, and over time, that copy degrades? If you only test your tool against the data that you have yourself, it's not gonna be able to surface the bias or to surface the challenges that might be within that tool. And so we need to provide an infrastructure for industry to walk alongside schools and districts to be able to make sure their tools are equitable.
Thank you. I just want to really quickly, in the 2023 survey by the Center for Democracy and Technology, almost 40% of teachers reported that sensitive student data was being shared with law enforcement and being used in predictive policing algorithms to identify children who may commit future criminal behavior. And this was closer to 50% of teachers at schools receiving Title I funding and closer to 60% of special education teachers. I wanted to mention that before I kind of just conclude, because without guidance, accountability, and oversight from a functioning Department of Education, AI surveillance in schools will exacerbate the school-to-prison pipeline and cause irreversible harm to Black, brown, and other vulnerable communities. It's why I introduced a piece of legislation last year that will require the federal agency using AI to establish a dedicated civil rights office to identify, prevent, and address algorithmic biases. But that's just scratching the surface. We know that there's so much more to do. So I thank you so much for your time, and I yield back.